Welcome to the Same Day Podcast, where we discuss driving incremental business growth and other topics related to real estate, property management, and entrepreneurship. Now to the show at hand.
Matt Zalk here. I'm the host of the Same Day Podcast, where I connect with top business experts and real estate leaders. Recent past guests include Will Gilbreck of Franklin Heating and Air, Northwest Arkansas, talking about all things heating and air, including why home warranty companies are not great for homeowners or investment property owners, really. Today's episode is brought to you by Chris Lyle State Farm. Chris Lyle State Farm helps you protect your most precious assets and investments, whether it's your home and auto, investment rental properties, or other valuables. Call Chris Lyle State Farm for a quick and painless phone call to potentially save you double digits on all of your insurance needs. Visit diallyle.com or call his office at 918-878-7771. This episode is also brought to you by Keyrenter Property Management. At Keyrenter Property Management, we are a full-service property management company helping our clients buy, renovate, and operate real estate assets. We help our clients build wealth while taking the headache out of property management. That's why no matter what rental you have, single-family homes, condos, townhomes, apartments, we have the management solutions that you need. Today's guest is Paul Dougherty. He's the owner of RestoPros of Tulsa, a water, fire, smoke, and mold mitigation company. Paul brings a unique perspective to the industry, blending his background in technology, real estate, and entrepreneurial endeavors. He focuses on creating unique solutions for difficult problems. Paul Dougherty, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great, Matt. Thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, I'm so happy that you're here. I've not had somebody from a restoration company on the show before, so I'm excited to kind of dig in and understand a bunch of stuff, the difference between restoration, mitigation, what all is entailed in both of these services. But let's start. Will you just introduce your company and let's talk for a second about how you got involved in restoration?
Absolutely. So Paul Dougherty with RestoPros of Tulsa. My wife and I started down the path of looking for a business to buy, and we looked at some franchises. We looked at buying some existing businesses, and the restoration industry just kind of kept rising to the top as something that we were interested in. One, something that's always necessary. It's kind of an Amazon-proof business, COVID-proof. So it had a lot of those
AI
components.
proof.
What's that?
AI proof.
AI proof, right? Exactly. And it's customer service. It's helping somebody in a time of need. And then, the population that we work with a lot of plumbers and homeowners, and just felt like a really good thing. So that's how we got into it. RestoPros is a franchise that started in Charlotte, North Carolina. And and they've been in business for a number of years, probably in about 50 or 60 markets right now, moving east to west. And so we were lucky enough to buy the Tulsa market.
But let me ask you, so you say you like being in business with plumbers and electricians and whatever else. Are you a blue collar guy yourself? Do you swing a hammer?
No, quite the opposite. So I've had a desk job for the last a lot of years, and am an IT manager and manage a lot of technology and things like that. And that's a really exciting industry, but it's also one that there's always, the job just continues to grow, and our projects continue to evolve. So it's kind of a fun industry to get involved in, that it's you're kind of in and out. So
I also love hanging out with plumbers and tradesmen in general, and I'm always kind of like looking over their backs, just looking at and I say, I'm really sorry. I know it's super annoying that I'm just watching everything you do. And I joke that I'm, moving in to learn a little bit more so I can steal their profession, which would never actually happen. But it's fascinating to see how stuff comes together, gets put together, how it gets fixed, how pipes get installed, how they get cut out when they need to be reinstalled, etc. Let's talk for a second about the difference between mitigation and restoration, because that, what you're going to cut out, what you're going to put back is, makes a huge difference in the pricing of, different services and how much it's going to cost ultimately when something goes wrong at your house. So explain to us what the difference between mitigation and restoration would be.
Absolutely. And a lot of times you need both. So, but the mitigation is really, how do we resolve the problem that's there? So if we have water infiltration, water that's in walls, floors, things like that, we need to get that dried out. That's really the mitigation process, is really getting that property back to where it can be restored, right? Okay. And then the restoration side is actually rebuilding it, putting the drywall back. We have to put the floors back in, et cetera. And what's really interesting about the RestoPros model is we really focus on mitigation. We don't focus on restoration. We leave that to the homeowner to choose somebody that they're comfortable with.
Mhm.
And the really nice thing about that model is that we actually strive to save the homeowner money in the end, because we we don't make our money on that build back. We make our money on the drying, just like
Right.
everybody does. And you're going to pay the same amount for that. Those are industry standards. Insurance companies have there's a national rate card that's used. So that drying component's going to cost the same no matter which company that you choose. But by focusing just on that mitigation, we're going to try and dry in place as much as we can. And there are plenty of times you have to take materials out in order to really make sure that it's dry, because that's the most important part of what we do, is really making sure it's dry, making sure there's no growth that occurs and that sort of thing. But our goal is to do it with the least damage to the property as possible. And
Minimally invasive.
minimally invasive, absolutely, right? And get that homeowner back in that, or that landlord back in business, or whoever it is, to get them back in business and using that space as quickly as possible.
But so you're too kind to say it directly, but if I understand correctly, reading between the lines, the idea is that some restoration companies, without casting aspersion and without saying people are dishonest, but some restoration companies would potentially do more damage in the mitigation side because they also make money on the restoration side. So if they have to rip up hardwoods, they might come in with a bid to repair the hardwoods. And of course, you could tell the restoration company, no, I want to go with my own hardwood company, or I have a cheaper bid. But the idea would be, if I pull this sheetrock all the way out, then I've got to go back with kind of accepted national standard pricing for replacing the sheetrock. And that's the idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Got it.
like you said, it's not saying that all those companies do that, because they certainly don't, but there's just more opportunity for that in that space. And there's just a little less motivation to, use a drying method that doesn't require any material removal.
Right. So one example is, you did at my house some drying, some mitigation of
Mhm.
water intrusion, and essentially you set up, you took the baseboard out, or equivalent, because I didn't have baseboard in my house at the time, but it would be the exact space where the baseboard would go. You drilled a couple of holes, you put a suction mechanism and then a push mechanism from the top, and you pushed air through the cavity so that ultimately we don't have to take out any sheetrock. We don't have to repair any sheetrock. We just put the baseboard trim directly over those couple of holes, and the inside of the wall is dried. But why do you actually need to dry that interior space? Won't it just dry on its own?
Well, everything potentially eventually dries, but that by not really getting the air in there, you face the risk of microbial growth, or that can begin within 24 to 48 hours. But the other thing that does is it facilitates wood rot, dry rot, wet rot. And so you think that it's going to dry on its own, but it's back there stuck between maybe an exterior wall and some sheetrock. It's not going to dry anytime soon, right? And there may be concrete underneath it.
Mm.
And so by getting that dry in a quick quick period of time, you're able to ensure that the integrity of that material is maintained.
And so if there is wicking, like if there's water all over the floor and it wicks up the sheetrock, what do you guys do to dry the sheetrock?
So sheetrock actually is an interesting animal depending on how wet it is and how much damage it is. There are times you certainly have to cut it out. Depending on how severe the water was, you may have to do a flood cut to be able to get to those to the walls to dry them. But a lot of times, if there's not a ton of water in there, you can do that through some air movement. And like we did at your house, right? Poke those holes in there, create that vortex of air going through that cavity, and then add dehumidification to the process and some heat. And then also containing the space, right? Like we put up barriers to keep that contained, but it's not just to contain it from the exterior space, it's to control the drying environment.
The
Right.
humidity levels, it makes it easier to pull humidity out of a specific
Exactly.
space instead of the whole house, for example.
Right. Right.
And
And there's some other tools that we have, and I think we use some of them at your house, that we have a mat system that does injection drying. And so we use it on your drywall. We also use it on hardwood floors. And what that does is it pushes heated air into those surfaces and allows them to dry. And if you think about drywall, it's not a solid surface, right? There are pores through
It's
there,
porous.
so air will move through that drywall. Now, if it was a ceiling and it got completely saturated, you're going to need to pull that down because there's too much water in there that you're gonna have growth. It's gonna sag. It's gonna fall. But a lot of times, if it's a small leak that impacted a wall or something like that, you can take care of that without getting too invasive.
If you put all that equipment on a wall or on a floor or whatever, all the stuff you just described, how long does it generally take to mitigate the wetness?
Typical drying times are anywhere from 3 to 5 days, depending on conditions, and there's a lot that depends on conditions, right? How well we're able to control the conditions in that space, other weather factors, things like that. But typically, you can get that material dry within 3 to 5 days. And we use moisture meters to do those readings. We have all kinds of different moisture meters. We have surface ones that check the moisture from the surface. And then there are other materials like wood where you really need to use a probe meter or a hammer probe to get in there to really get the reading of that material.
And what's the implication if you don't do this work, if you just kind of sweep it under the proverbial rug? We talked a little bit about dry wood and dry rot and wet rot, if I can just speak. Who cares? Why does that even matter?
Well, if you're me and my personal experience, it means that I end up having to go in and replace things, right? Like I've had it happen where I've had, doors rot out at the bottom and we have to go in and replace those, or windows. We've had, subfloor come out from underneath a hardwood floor where there was some water intrusion that went under it. I had another example at a rental house where we had a small leak coming out of a bathroom and we didn't know about it was the situation, but it got under some hardwood floors, ended up buckling those up. The challenge was I didn't know much about mitigation at the time. And so I didn't know there was somebody I could hire to come in and dry that out. And it took us 3 months to get that subfloor dry enough to put new hardwood floors back over the top of.
So the hardwood, the subfloor, even after it swelled, it kind of shrank back down, and you could put hardwoods over it. You didn't have to repair the subfloor.
Right. Yeah. If you dry it correctly, and that may be we're drying it from underneath and from the top, like if it's a crawl space situation, depending on where that moisture was. And we may dry it from both sides to make sure that it's dried well. And then that hammer probe, those probes go down into the wood so we really can measure that moisture content.
So speaking of crawl spaces, we've had various situations where there have been all sorts of stuff in crawl spaces. Sometimes it's just rainwater and the water is not running away from the house as it should be.
Right.
There might not be gutters, and so things are flooding under the crawl space, and then something takes place and we need to get under the crawl space, but it's just a pool down there. So the plumber says, I can't get down there. I need it to be dry before I get there. Whatever else. We've even had situations where raw sewage is leaking down because they didn't plumb the house properly. That was a ridiculous situation where the plumber called me and was like, hey, who did this renovation? This is insane. The plumbing has just been running into the crawl space for the last 6 months. Oh my God. If you have to mitigate that situation where there's a pool of whether human waste or just rainwater under a house, what do you do? How do you get that out?
So 2 different situations. So let's talk about both of them. So first of all, if it's rainwater or, I've had like a pipe break under a house and, drop 20,000 gallons of water, we will pump that moisture out. We'll pump the water out. And then we work to contain that crawl space. And then we'll use heat and air to dry the crawl space.
Do you literally just pump that like 20,000 gallons into the nearest, you just right to the street and let it run down the sewer?
Right.
Wow. Okay.
Some of that'll probably naturally have evacuated down into the ground. But what we're going to do is go get whatever remains in there, and we're going to pump that out, and then we're going to put a drying system in place to dry it. But we create that air movement.
We had Adam Sedlak on the show from Level Home Restoration Foundation, Level Foundation, and it's just that if that much water absorbs into the ground underneath your house and the shift that occurs, that what I expect would occur, you're going to naturally see a bunch of walls cracking and a bunch of other stuff because your footing is just not meant to be that moist. But anyway, so that's a whole different problem if it's absorbing into the ground. But okay, so you take it out, you suck it out, you remove it, and then you move air through that space.
We move air and we use a crawl space drying system to dry it.
Got it.
So
what does that system look like?
It's just basically heat injected into the crawl space. It creates that because heat creates evaporation. And that's one thing. There's the different drying systems. There's closed drying systems, open drying systems, and it depends on what your outside atmosphere is like. So it's going to depend on the time of the year, how much humidity and moisture is in the air. When we went through this and my wife and I got certified, it sounds like a very simple thing, but there's a lot of science to it. There's a lot of complexity to how do you create the system that's really going to dry that situation correctly.
Yeah.
I want to touch on that, but I'm going to jump back to your question about the sewage. So the sewage is a different situation, right? Still going to have to be pumped out, but that's what's called a Category 3 loss. So there are different categories of loss. So the Category 1 is just basically clean water. Your toilet supply line breaks or a line under a sink or something like that. Clean water needs to be cleaned up, needs to be dried, but there's no real hazard to it. There's a Category 2 in which it was clean water that traveled through some things that we don't really know that they didn't contaminate the water. And then there's Category 3, which is really biohazard. So if sewage is leaking into an area, so one, we have to, how we prepare ourselves to go into that space, the equipment, the respirators, things like that we use. But then also we've got to treat that space, make sure that we take out everything that needs to be taken out because there's a lot of impacted things, and then treat that surface to kill whatever.
So as to avoid a regional cholera outbreak.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, that's gross. I don't envy the guys that are getting down there into that crawl space with their biohazard suits and cleaning that space out and making it.
Me either.
Making it suitable for the plumber. We had a situation years ago down in Jinx, at a house in Jinx, where tenants left for Christmas, came back after the holiday, and their house a pipe had burst, their house had flooded, come out from underneath the cabinet, and it just flooded all the floors and everything else. If you get water behind cabinets, for example, how can you mitigate that moisture infiltration without pulling out all the cabinets? And like, then once you pull out the cabinets, I guess you could theoretically go back with them, but that would be a mess. You might end up installing new cabinets.
Exactly. And it's going to depend on how long that water was leaking. So if you catch that pretty quick, we may be able to use a non-invasive drying method. We may be able to use like mats on the back of the cabinet or the floors of the cabinets to dry them. You may be able to just take out the bottom piece, and the floor of that cabinet and then just replace that. If that water ran for 5 days, you're probably going to have to really pull them out because it's probably going to have gotten in all that wood. It's probably going to be pretty difficult to dry. So it's just going to depend on the severity of what happened and where it was.
I wonder, because then theoretically you can't just drill holes in the back of the cabinet wood and the sheetrock because you got the studs in the way. So you can get the vertical flow, but you can't get the horizontal flow to mitigate the.
Depends if you can. Depends what's on the back side of it. So if you're on an interior wall, you can a lot of times go from the back side to dry that. So we can dry from the front, and then dry from the back. So we can pull toe kicks, put air in that way. We can, in the back of the cabinet, you could put holes in there. Nobody's going to see those. You use a mat system, but as long as you can get to that back wall, and you may do a flood cut back there, and really, and a flood cut's basically a 2-foot strip of drywall that you cut out.
Got it.
And that's if you're provided the water didn't go up any higher than that. That allows you to get those sill plates really good and dry, and it also minimizes the what has to be done to replace that drywall. Right? You can use an 8-foot or regular 4-foot wide sheet, split it, and get 16 feet out of it. but you would flood cut on the backside of that and then dry from the back as well. And if you're able to do that, then you may be able to minimize what you have to tear out in the kitchen.
Yeah. So all this, to be honest, sounds pretty expensive. What kind of money are people looking at when we start talking about mitigation services?
Well, I think there are a number of different pieces of that. So one is this is all dictated through this industry, right? And so the rates are the same across the United States, with the exception of they're regionally adjusted. They're actually adjusted by zip code. And a lot of that is labor rates. So there are materials and things like that that are a certain cost, but labor, they varies, et cetera. But so there's a standard rate system for that. And again, it's going to depend on what it is, what the cost is going to be. But I think the other way to think of it is how much money can you save by doing it, right? Because you think that, oh man, that's a lot of money up front that somebody wants. But if 3 months later my hardwood floors haven't buckled up, was it worth it? Right? If I can be back in my home in a week versus 6 months, is it worth it? Right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot more to it. If I don't have dry rot that then, 2 years later, I figure out that I have to have dealt with. The other thing is a lot of these things are covered by insurance, right? And so we help that homeowner, or commercial business. We've talked a lot about homeowners, but we do commercial properties as well. But we help them through that claim process. So they start that claim, that we work with that insurance company. We know what words to use and what not to use, right? Like never say leak. Leaks aren't covered by insurance. Failures are covered, right? So at a plumbing failure. So we work through that process with the insurance company to make that as successful of a process as possible. And really kind of help with that, getting that homeowner.
Does that mean that after a homeowner starts a claim, that homeowner should avoid speaking directly to the adjuster and let you guys kind of handle all that discussion?
I would, and you've worked with enough insurance companies, you've learned that sometimes saying less is more.
For sure.
Right. That we had a deal early on when we started this where the homeowner somehow decided to mention to the insurance company that there was mold. And then the insurance guy's like, hey, it's not covered. We don't do mold. Well, it wasn't really
the dreaded
mold.
M word.
And yes, the dreaded M word, mold. And we don't say it. We say microbial growth.
And what's the difference?
Well, microbial growth extends far beyond what standard mold is. But the other thing is that within your policy, mold is excluded. So when you say mold to them, they think you have damage that was caused by mold, right? And so there are some policies that cover mold. There are others that don't.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a relatively commonly excluded item. But if you had a water leak today and you call your insurance this afternoon, tomorrow, you didn't get mold in that period of time.
Yeah.
You didn't get microbial growth in that period of time, right? If something happens, it's a product of that. And there are mold spores everywhere, right? But then when you put water on them, that starts the growth, and then you add heat to it, and that's where that can kind of
escalate.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we like to work with that homeowner and really help them through that process so that they're not left holding the bag, trying to figure out how to navigate those waters with their insurance company.
But I'm trying to think, there could be a perverse incentive where somebody, wants, if their deductible is $10,000 and there's $9,000 worth of damage, they might as well say, well, let me get a claim that covers the replacement of the entirety of this hardwood floor. Sure, it's going to be disruptive and I'm going to be gone from the house for 4 months or whatever, but they might have a perverse incentive to actually get more work done through the insurance company. Now, I imagine that that's short-sighted, because if that's the case, you're going to naturally, your rates are going to go up. Your premium is going to go up in the insurance ultimately, but maybe you got, $20,000 or $30,000 worth of coverage and your insurance goes up just a hair.
Yeah.
Per year.
There are choices in how we deal with things, right? Like we can dry or tear things out based on different requirements and needs. But there are times people want to do that. They want to use that as the impetus to get a whole new thing. But it was interesting because we worked a deal, and it was actually one that you referred to us from a plumber a few weeks ago, and we talked to them, like this probably could be categorized where we could tear it all out and you could have all new. And they were like, if we're going to get something all new, this bathroom's not where we want to start. Right. So they're like, we really just want it dry. We've got a party coming up in 7 days that we need to be ready for. And so how can we get there? Right. And so we went in, we dried it. We helped them find a drywall person, a painter to come in. And, a week later, they're back in business, had 40 or 50 people at their house, and nobody knew anything had happened.
Yeah. So what do you do with tenants when there's a disruption? Obviously, from a property management perspective, oftentimes an owner wants to minimize cost.
Right.
They're not going to go back and live at this house. It was an investment property to begin with, potentially, whatever. And tenants want the property back in tip-top shape as soon as humanly possible. What can you do to minimize the disruption time for a tenant? And what do you say to them when, they can't use a bathroom for a couple of days or whatever?
Well, I think that, one of the primary things, so I have a few properties, and my rule is, please don't talk to my tenant, talk to me when I hire somebody, right? Mm-hmm. Because I want to control that message, and not control it, but I want to make sure that the right decision's being made.
It's like, this HVAC unit could catch fire at any moment. Right. Oh my God.
Yes. As every other one in the United States today. But yeah. And so then they start telling you need a new HVAC unit, right? So one is, we work with those property managers on that messaging. I think that, again, with our approach, we're trying to get it dry as fast as we can. Again, trying to save that property manager some money. We follow IICRC certification standards, the S500. Those are used across the world, not just in the United States, as far as what our requirements are for how we manage the mitigation process. Every restoration company should. There are opportunities if there's something that somebody doesn't want to do, as long as they're willing to accept that risk and, sign a waiver that doesn't come back to us, then, we can make decisions about and tailor those services to what is needed to resolve that particular incident.
And tenants come to us and say, I need to be put in a hotel for a week because of this sort of thing. These sorts of things can become nightmares for the property manager. Right. And us talking to the owner and saying a tenant wants a credit for the rent, and not having to explain to a tenant how they would be just as displaced and discomforted if it was their house, but now they also have to pay the bill. So give us a break. And the owner's out a couple $1,000. So please bear with us.
Yeah. Renters don't seem to understand that. I always tell my wife, like, nobody's coming and fixing my air conditioner on a Sunday, but everybody expects theirs to be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What do we do? What can we avoid, or what steps can we take to avoid having to do mitigation or restoration in the first place? Anything that you can think of? Obviously, if there's a plumbing failure, there's maybe little that you could have done to prevent it. But do you see things where you walk into a house and you're like, ooh, that's a potential disaster that needs to be changed?
Well, I think one, when you buy a property, make sure you're doing your inspections, that you understand the condition of what you're purchasing. If you have deferred maintenance, if you have fixtures that are on their last leg, replace them. Talk to a plumber about the right supply lines to use.
Yes.
It's a big, big difference, right? That use those inexpensive supply lines and they break. And then you've got a big problem. I had it happen on a hot water heater. A guy put them on and they were the cheap ones, and it's a pinhole goes in them. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is, we're coming up on winter. It's time to make sure that you are well insulated, that when the weather gets really cold, that you're leaving your faucets stripped, that if you need to block off your crawl space vents, things like that, so that you're trying to minimize the situations with your pipes, because a lot of what happens is in the winter, those pipes will freeze.
Yeah.
And sometimes they thaw and there's never a problem, but there are a lot of times those bust and cause some pretty catastrophic disasters.
Yeah. So as we said earlier in the show, you guys focus on the mitigation, but not necessarily the restoration. What happens when an owner's like, hey, Paul, I want to turnkey service. I don't want to have to deal with any of this. The insurance company's paying for it anyways. Just fix it.
Right.
How do you guys deal with that?
So, one thing that I always think in business is important is to stay with your specialty, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, we're not staffed to manage that process of the restoration. So, I would rather not make that homeowner mad, even if we don't get their business. But really, the way that we would approach it is we would say, we have people that we know, we have some people that we can refer to you. We don't guarantee their work, we don't manage their work, but we've got people at different levels. You just need a painter, you just need somebody to come in and do some drywall, or you need somebody to come in and do a remodel, right? We've got some different people, and they're continuing to vet people to put on that list. We're picky about who we put on, but again, we can't guarantee their services. But we do try to have a handoff to somebody else if that's something that the homeowner wants.
So you have a full suite of vendors that you refer.
We're working on that list. Yeah.
Love that. Any other pushback that you get from potential clients? I guess in the moment you're kind of there and you're the hero. You fly in with a super cape because people are like, I'm about to start getting microbial growth or whatever. My house is flooding and leaking, whatever. It's you're there and kind of you're like an ambulance. You come in right at the right time. So maybe people don't have significant pushback, but anything that you found that caused people to want to go a different direction?
I think that that's a great question. And I think one of the things that you see is people are like, well, I'm just going to file the claim. I'm going to take the money. I'm going to buy a couple of fans and put them on. We'll call it good. And then
Interesting.
I'll tear out what I want to tear out and build it back. And so I think they think about that and probably don't realize that. Like one thing I didn't know before this is when I was putting fans on things, I was not creating air movement. I was just pushing air onto something, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't facilitate a drying process. But I think that's probably the main thing. Or, insurance deductibles have gotten so high that a lot of people are afraid to really even go down the path because and then your insurance company kind of holds you hostage and says, well, if you file a claim, it's going to go in your account, whether we pay it, whether you actually pay it or not. And so I think that's one of the other things. But I think we need to remember we've got insurance for a reason. And if we really have a catastrophe or disaster, we need to take care of it.
It's also easy potentially to sweep things under the rug, as I said earlier, because you may not see the extent of the damage. Yes. If you don't pull off your sheetrock or punch holes and put a little camera probe down there, or actually do a moisture reading on the wall, you don't know, and you can't feel it necessarily when you touch the wall. So you don't know what's happening behind that wall until you actually get in there and see it. And so it's easy to overlook it, to say, look, the cost is too much, and then not realize that you're stepping over dollars to pick up pennies.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Because of the damage that goes on underneath that. And when my wife was at training, and they were touring some of the properties in Charlotte, and a lot of them had deferred maintenance issues, right? Yeah. People hadn't taken care of things. They had leaking showers, they had leaking windows and things like that. And then you end up with a pretty good sized remediation bill at the end of that.
Yeah. And ultimately, I guess, because as my friend Chris Lyle is fond of saying, insurance covers things that are sudden and unexpected, which is why you would say, I guess, a plumbing failure and not a slow leak. So if you don't do anything and you avoid it at the onset after 6 months or 3 months or whatever, your insurance company is not going to cover it. Is that right?
Exactly. And that's the real tragedy, right? Because you had the damage and it needed to be dealt with. And now it's on your dime, not theirs. And it's probably more because something happened as a result of not dealing with it, right?
And insurance companies are looking for ways to say no to your mold exclusion and a bunch of other stuff, the sudden and unexpected. They're looking for a reason to say no because they're a business looking to stay in business.
Exactly.
And earn profits. So the sooner you get to it, the more the quicker you are to hire an expert that can actually speak to the insurance company, the better off you'll be.
Absolutely.
Paul Dougherty is the owner of RestoPros Tulsa, water, fire, smoke, and mold mitigation company. Paul brings a unique perspective to the industry, blending his background in tech, real estate, and entrepreneurial endeavors. He focuses on creating unique solutions to difficult problems. You can visit Paul at RestoProTulsa.com to find out more information and connect. Paul, where can people reach you if they want to give you a shout?
You can reach me directly at 918-688-7345, or our company number is 918-200-9884. We'd love to help you out. One of the things I like to tell people is we do free inspections. We will come out and look. If there's no damage there, we'll walk away. We did it the other day for somebody, took a look and was like, hey, this isn't bad enough for us to do something. You can handle it this way. But let us come out, let us take a look at it and advise you, and then you can make the decision of how you want to move forward.
Put Paul's number on speed dial. Call him once a week. Never know when
Perfect.
You're going to need him. Paul, thank you for being on the show. Appreciate all your insight.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Same Day Podcast. Tune in to a new show each week and be sure to subscribe to get future episodes.